Hello, hello. Welcome to another My Ed Space free stream for Key Stage 5 English. Hello, hello, and welcome to Key Stage 5 English for My Ed Space. We will be continuing our discussion of Othello, looking particularly at the character of Desdemona today. Her positioning, her characterization, her trajectory across the play, her ending, her innocence, her transgression, her role as a Jacobean woman and a wife in this society in which this was such a key role for women to inhabit. And we will be moving from there, looking at critics and the text itself and the relevant context as well. Amina, hello, welcome, thank you for joining. So let's get into it. I was just saying that we are looking at Othello today in this continuation of our free stream course on Othello and focusing today on Desdemona. So we've looked at Othello and we've looked at Iago, and this is our third character we're going to be looking at, Desdemona, who sort of completes this triangle of characters whose action and reaction in the plays are the most crucial and really about whom the play is constructed. Just a reminder of who I am. I'm Eleanor. I'm one of the My Ed Space teachers doing the Key Stage 5 course for My Ed Space. We'll be covering all of the content all across the year for the most common text for A-level, regardless of exam board. And all of these will be available as free streams forever on YouTube, so you will be able to access them and replay them whenever is needed. Now, let's take a look at what we know about Desdemona thus far. So some of this is going to link back to previous lessons, but if this is your first time, still go ahead and answer any of these questions that you can, depending on where people are in their study of Othello and what they know about it thus far. They might have more information about some of these answers than others, but we will go over all of them and then people will have the content they need to get started. Okay, so first of all, who is Desdemona? Pop into the chat what you know about Desdemona, the character, what happens to her, who is she, what is her relationship with other characters, for example. Then the next question is, in what ways does she fulfill Jacobean gender expectations? So this is thinking about our context that we looked at when we looked at gender and blackness. The third one, in what ways does she subvert Jacobean gender expectations? So this is the resisting rather than the supporting that you were looking at in question 2. And then question 4, what happens to her at the end of the play? What is her conclusion? How do we view it? If you want to add any significance that you know about this as well, please do. And then what is the Madonna-whore dichotomy, which we did look at in previous lessons, particularly our lesson on gender and blackness, but we've made reference to in the lessons on Othello and Iago as well, and on their view of women, their relationships with women as well. So let's get started, as I can see a little bit of reticence in the chat. So first of all, who is Desdemona? She is the daughter of Brabantio, who is Venetian noble. Venetian noble who's part of the circle of Venetian elite, including the Duke of Venice, and is often involved in these councils that we can see when we see Brabantio for the first time, and Desdemona and Othello for the first time as well, as Brabantio brings this matter to the Duke to be determined. We also know she is the wife of Othello, We know she's friends with Emilia, who's Iago's wife. And we know that she is really the embodiment of Jacobean femininity. And as such, she is really well regarded in Venetian society. So she is described as divine Desdemona, most blessed. And she has status and power in society because of her feminine accomplishments, as we could say. The idea that she is pure, she's polite, she's kind, she has a good reputation, she's beautiful, and as such, she is able to move through circles that Othello isn't necessarily given access to by birth, and as a result of his race and outsider status. So in a way, she is powerful. We also know that she is lovely, right? She's really sweet. She seems to be very loving of Othello. She can't conceive of him not loving her back or being angry at him, angry at his accusations, even though he accuses her of having an affair with Cassio. And we know that to the point of her death, she is forgiving and accepting of that. However, we also know that she is also transgressive. She runs away in the middle of the night to marry Othello without her father's approval. We know that she falls in love with his stories of adventure and wants to join him in Cyprus, which is somewhere far from the civilization and the hierarchy and protection of Venice that she knows. We know that she leaves her father's house. Her father essentially disowns her, and seemingly she never sees him again. And though Brabantio dies, Desdemona doesn't seemingly think about it at all again. We also know that she's linked with this handkerchief, which is crucial to the plot of the play. Crucial because this is the ocular proof, the visual proof, in other words, of Desdemona's seeming infidelity. We're going to look at different interpretations of this handkerchief going forwards, but it is important to consider Desdemona's link with the handkerchief when you're talking about Desdemona. In what ways does she fulfill gender expectations? These expectations were purity, modesty, submission, obedience, both to husband and father. So interesting when Desdemona says that she sees herself as having a divided duty, talking about owing duty to her father and her husband as well. We also know beauty, politeness and manners, etc., and passivity as well. So when Othello tells her to do things like kneel on the ground, when he hits her in the face in public, she kind of, though upset about it, definitely doesn't resist a huge amount. In what ways does she subvert her marriage? Her seeking of adventure in pursuing Othello because she wants to hear his stories. And that too, right? The fact that she is the one in Othello and Desdemona's accounts that pursues him romantically, not the other way around. Extremely transgressive for the time. She disobeys her father. And she misplaces her handkerchief. And we will see why that takes on so much significance as a transgression. In a way as well, though, she's also speaks up for herself. The fact that she even dares to contradict her father or Othello, and that she defends her actions is also transgressive itself, especially in a public sphere like the court. What happens to her to the end of the play? She is smothered by Othello in her bed. Smothered by Othello in her bed. She is proved to be innocent. And she tries to cover up the fact that Othello murders her by saying that she did it to herself to Emilia when Emilia comes in. What happens to her? Here we are. And then what's the Madonna-whore dichotomy? So this is a theory and a development within patriarchal societies in which there is a dichotomy. Di meaning two. This dichotomy is a split into two. This dichotomy of women within patriarchal structures into either Madonnas, so this chaste, pure, maternal virgin figure like the Madonna or like the Virgin Mary, passive image, or as the whore, as someone who is sexually active, who's worldly, who's full of lust, who's sinful, who's seductive, etc. So if we're going to think about this in biblical terms, this is the Virgin Mary, the Madonna, and this is the biblical Eve. So the Eve of Adam and Eve, who is seduced by the snake and seduces Adam into eating the apple that condemns them from the Garden of Eden and causes suffering for all mankind. So let's take a look first, and I've written this up for you just so you can get an overview of Desdemona if you are still early on in your study of Desdemona. So I'm going to read this, and then any questions you have about her, pop into the chat. What I do want is for people to organise their thoughts into the different presentations that we see of Desdemona, because that's what we're going to look at next. And we're going to brainstorm together what and how Shakespeare presents Desdemona in the play. So the play begins after the offstage and secret marriage of Othello and Desdemona. Given the restrictive patriarchal context in which Shakespeare was writing, Desdemona is initially presented as a strong and assertive female voice who seeks out and engages with Othello and is active in developing their relationship. Hugely transgressive. Othello in Act 1, Scene 3 describes that Desdemona is particularly attracted to him due to his stories of adventure and mishap in his military career. Indeed, Othello calls her his fair warrior. When summoned to the Duke's house, Desdemona calmly defends her choice in saying, "I did love the more to live with him," and confronts her father publicly by describing her now divided duty to both her husband and father. Her choice of language and independence is foregrounded as she chooses to remain with Othello rather than returning meekly to her father's house in shame. When the Duke discharges Othello to Cyprus, Desdemona insists on coming with him, another indicator of her spirited independence. Desdemona and Othello are reunited, having journeyed to Cyprus separately. Here, Iago's machinations develop quickly, and Desdemona is confusingly questioned by Othello and asked after her lost handkerchief. Emilia reassures her that any jealousy must have been stoked externally, as clearly Desdemona is innocent of any misbehaviour. Later, Desdemona is asked to intercede for Cassio and pleads his case to Othello, despite the increasing jibes and questions. Desdemona is continuously interrogated by Othello or cast in scenes by Iago, but is otherwise not often on stage. Again, she is comforted by Emilia, and when Othello again questions her, she defends herself, even in the final scene in which she insists, upon point of death, that she has done nothing to hurt Othello. She asks to be commended to him with her dying breath, and it is both Emilia and Othello who cast themselves next to her as they die too. Othello's final description of Desdemona describes her as a pearl richer than all his tribe, and a light. Clearly for him, she is returned to purity in death and innocence, but also remains an object for him to possess and control. So this isn't the summary of the whole play, but rather of Desdemona's trajectory through it. And so there being gaps in it, in terms of the other action of the play, Iago's machinations on Othello in more detail, for example, is not really relevant if we're thinking about what Desdemona's role and her presentation is across the play so far. So, how can we describe Desdemona's trajectory? What is she like as a character? What lines of argument can we think about her? Well, and feel free to put in the chat any that comes up for you. These ideas, first of all, as an active and transgressive woman, she marries Othello, wants adventure, defends herself, etc. So that's one idea here. Another idea, that she is a victim of Othello's, right? He murders her, abuses her, treats her like an object, etc. We can also think of this separately as this idea of her being a passive object. And not just in the eyes of Othello, but also in the eyes of the other characters. If we think of the way Desdemona is described across the play, she's described by Brabantio and Rodrigo and Iago as well as a possession to own, to exchange. She serves a kind of transactional purpose between the men, especially if we think about her responsibility in bolstering men's reputation, chiefly Othello and Brabantio, whose manhood and masculinity is dependent on her own perfection and her own chastity in particular. We can think of her as well as linked with purity. This idea of her being divine. The imagery of the handkerchief. Her virginity being kind of the anxiety of the play. And this black and white imagery that is carried entirely through the play which to a certain extent is obviously going to happen in a Jacobean play about race. But also if we're thinking about what this looks like for Othello in particular, this idea of white and black being linked to miscegenation, so being linked to ideas of interracial couples and children as a result of interracial couples. Also thinking about this idea of purity versus devilry, and Othello being this devil that is corrupting her purity, and thus this black and white image becomes the sooty bosom, that idea of contamination. Not just in the black and white imagery, but also in terms of thinking about her purity as well. This idea of her purity being corrupted or contaminated in some way. And what people view her like when they think that that's the case, right? With that, we can also think of her in a kind of alternative argument as perhaps naive, careless, blamable perhaps as well. Because she does lose the handkerchief and she seems relatively unconcerned about it. And if we look back at the Jacobean view of the role of a handkerchief and its visuality in this time, then it takes on more of this. Could we think of her as well as fallen in some way? She becomes the perfect trajectory, if we're looking at purity, to her contamination, perhaps fulfilling the Madonna-whore dichotomy. We could think of her as Iago's victim. We could look at her relationship with Emilia as this kind of couple of moments of female character interaction in the play. But it really does become quite important, especially when we consider the handkerchief and the final scene in which Emilia's actions really do reveal the key, and it is Emilia who is unquestionably undoubting of Desdemona's purity. We can also take a look at her ending. And Scott said, I feel like she's idealistic both in the time period and modern day by being loyal, honourable in how she defies social expectations, stuff that. Yeah, so this idea that she can be both, right? She can be both defying in social expectations, but also does she think that she can just get away with that? And this is something I'd like to talk about a little bit later on as well, in terms of could she possibly have a different ending other than being killed? Would a Jacobean audience allow this play to conclude with Othello and Desdemona living happily ever after, with the implication being that they will have children and they will consummate this marriage? Because it seems like, and there is a lot of scholarship about this, they don't, perhaps. Would they be allowed to just do this or not? Would that be the message, especially if we think about Cynthia's version, in which the message, the moral, is look what happens when your daughters are too defiant. They run off and marry the Moor and end up dead. So it's more of a cautionary tale. But also we see that she is redeemed in some ways. She becomes that perfect, pure alabaster that Othello viewed her as before. She is proved her innocence. Her innocence is preserved. Knowing that Othello is written as a tragedy foreshadows the lack of a happily ever after. Absolutely. Yeah, we know it's a tragedy, and we know even from that beginning, from the title page, yes, but also from even from the fact that they've married in the first place. This isn't going to go well, is it? Society's power is too much. Okay. And we can also think about not just Desdemona's transgression, but also her power. Because in some instances we can say she does have power over Othello, or in society. Or in her knowledge of society, or in her ability to convince or to persuade her audience, in her power over herself, in conducting her arguments in front of the Duke. Right? In fact, Tennenhouse describes her as the embodiment of female power. She is the one who stands up not just for herself, but also for Othello, and claims him as her husband proudly when no one else will do as such. There are so many ways to think about her. These are some of the ways we're going to look at today. So firstly, this idea of her as a passive object that's not just in Othello's eyes, but also across the play. And perhaps this is highlighting something really key and really insidious about Jacobean society, that Desdemona is viewed like this and that women's treatment like this is completely normalized. So I'm just going to read these so we can hear what stands out to us here. Iago says, "Awake, what ho, Brabantio, thieves, thieves, look to your house, your daughter and your bags, thieves, thieves." Interesting immediately. "Zounds, sir, you're robbed. For shame, put on your nightgown. Your heart has burst. You've lost half your soul. Even now, very now, an old black ram is tupping your white ewe. Arise, arise, awake the snorting citizens with the bell, or else the devil will make a grandsire of you. Arise, I say." Iago also says, "You'll have your daughter covered with a Barbary horse. You'll have your nephews neigh to you. I am one, sir, that has come to tell you your daughter and the Moor are now making the beast with two backs." Othello later, when he is beginning to suspect the adultery, says, "I had been happy if the general camp, pioneers and all, had tasted her sweet body, so I had nothing known. Oh, now forever farewell the tranquil mind, farewell content." Iago says, "Would you, the supervisor, grossly gape on, behold her topped." And Emilia says about men in general, "They are all but stomachs, and we all but food. Men eat us hungrily, and when they are full, they belch us." Okay. So what stands out to us here that proves that Desdemona is a passive object, and it will give us something to talk about in a line of argument like this? First of all, we've got this idea of Iago aligning for Brabantio and for us, Desdemona as couched within these other possessions here. He says, "Thieves, thieves," as in something has been stolen. A possession of yours has been stolen. He doesn't say, rapist, he doesn't say monster, he says thief. Something of yours has been taken. And this is Desdemona. So this is something of yours has been taken. So immediately, Desdemona is foregrounded as an object here of possession for Brabantio and Iago as well, and is something over which Brabantio has ownership and can make claim in a court of law. And this does link to Jacobean ideas of ownership and agency, with women being dependent on their fathers. But if we look at where your daughter is, it's here in this middle part between house and bags. And if we think about the value of a daughter, what is the value of a daughter in Jacobean society? it's transactional. It is as a kind of possession. And what in particular of theirs? Their virginity, right? Because it is in exchanging their daughter in marriage, they are gaining access to power and resources in society. And women's requirement to be a virgin in Jacobean society before marriage is this idea that men were exchanging this virginity to ensure that their husbands, or that the new husband had full domain over the wife in terms of children, right? That it was unquestionably a sense of paternity here. It was exchanging women's virginity for legitimate progeny, so legitimate children. And this is what Brabantio has to exchange. So for a daughter as high value as Desdemona, we're thinking about this as a huge loss to Brabantio, not just in terms of reputation, not just in terms of his daughter, but also in terms of his status in society. If he's depending on her preservation of her virginity and her good marriage for his power. So there's this semantic field of robbery here, first of all. And then we have this idea of the old black ram tupping your white ewe. And first of all, we have this idea of zoomorphism, or animalistic graphic imagery, that really does pull through the text, especially in Act 1, but later we can see when Othello starts thinking this way as well, it is also incorporated into his language. And notice, your white ewe, we can see here not just the grossness of this imagery of this kind of farm animal intercourse, but also this idea of, again, possession and purity, this idea of the old black ram contaminating this whiteness with children, if we're thinking of sheep, that might not be pure white, and thus seeing the racialized anxieties here and the racism of Iago when he's trying to provoke Brabantio. And similarly as well, the colour imagery then builds us to the devil will make a grandsire or grandfather of you. So then this idea of blackness associated with devilry. And Desdemona, again, being an incubator of sorts for children that here would be evil. So again, she'd be engendering this. Similarly here, with a Barbary horse, your daughter covered, again, that means having sex with a Barbary horse, your nephews will neigh to you. So then this idea of bestiality or bestial imagery here really does highlight, first of all, the unnaturalness of this union in the eyes of the Venetians, but also this idea that this is all at Desdemona's expense, as well as Othello's. It's not just him who is being victimized by this language, it's also her. There is a violence and a brutality and a harshness in the way that her marriage is being described that really does speak to the kind of normalized violence against women of the time, right? If they're able to gleefully spread these images, she is then the object for them to use to drive Brabantio's anger, right? And it's all at her expense, right? It's her who is taking these kind of cheap shots here, and it is especially for a Jacobean audience, but also for us, a really strong presentation that is also unfair because we don't see her before we see this description. So we have only this description of Desdemona to start with, is of this transgressive, dirty, animalistic language. And it's the same, the your daughter and the more, again, this your, and we could argue definitely that he means your daughter, talking about, relationships. We can also think of this as possessive language, especially as there's so much of it. Your daughter and the more, again, we don't see Othello being described as with his name, but rather this pattern of referential strategies that dehumanizes him, also dehumanizes her, making the beast with two backs, which is euphemism is almost a stretch, but this idea of this being a euphemism for sex, but also again linking to this idea of bestiality and devilry, right? This unnatural way of talking. And let's see how this applies to Othello as well. He says he would have been happier if everyone had tasted Desdemona's sweet body. So either had sex with her or touched her, etc., than for him to know about one person who had. And this again speaks to this kind of violence in the language here of Desdemona as something to be consumed, her as this sweetness. And this language of consumption again shows that Desdemona really becomes an object. Language of consumption that also links to violence, right? It's her body is a thing for others to take nourishment from, or take pleasure from, or to consume. Here we can't see that he actually views her as human here, right? She is something to be take from, to consume, to enjoy, to nourish someone else's needs, but certainly not as someone who is equally participating in this. And again, when Iago is stirring up Othello and saying, and Othello says, well, we've got to catch them, we need proof. And he says, what? You want to see it? This idea of voyeurism here that links to this theme of appearance versus reality, of seeing in the play. And this idea of gaping on, and this being gross. This idea again of you want to see her having sex with someone else. Again, thinks of her, reduces her to this object of either proof or some kind of transgressive pleasure. And beholding her topped, again, violence in this language, because this is the language of farm animals, here and here, that now is in Othello's mind, which is why he becomes this kind of monstrous, angry, furious version of himself, is possibly because he can picture this, or maybe his own insecurities, as we've seen when we looked at him, that he can't keep her, satisfy her, be enough for her, etc. He's not man enough to. This speaks to that as well, this idea of cuckoldry as well. But within cuckoldry, we're not thinking of a woman as seeking out, but rather as a man failing to satisfy a woman sufficiently, to control a woman sufficiently, and thus still thinking of her as an object on which to perform these rites of masculinity. And then Emilia is so interesting because a lot of criticism thinks of her as this kind of feminist voice. in the play, or some proto-feminist voice really, because she describes men and sees this difference between they and we, thinking about the distance between the genders, the power dynamic between them. They are all but stomachs and we are food. So again, paired with what Othello says, this idea of consumption again. They eat us hungry. So they take women are objects for men's appetite. And interesting that Othello uses that same language of would that we call these delicate creatures our own, but not their appetite. So you can have a woman, but you still can't control her sexual appetite. And then when they are full, they belch us. So there's this idea of disposability here, or rejection. Here as well, or kind of throwing up, and it's gross as well, or belching, burping, this idea of expelling. That again speaks to what role women played in the time. If they are able to be eaten and then disposed of at a man's will, that really shows the powerlessness of women. And let's take a look at what some critics say about this idea. So these are paired with the quotations so that you can incorporate this into your own work if you want to use this. And it is the expectation you use critics in your work. So here is some places you can look up. It becomes clear that these two different ways of describing women don't actually apply to real women. Instead, they are male fantasies imposed on women, ideas that men want women to fulfill, and roles that women then therefore purposely play for men. For instance, Desdemona often describes her devotion to Othello in front of other people, underscoring that, even though she does love him very deeply, she was to a certain extent playing the role of the virtuous wife. Iago then stokes Othello's jealousy in part by forcing Othello to realize there is no way for a man to tell the difference between a truly virtuous wife and one who's just playing the role of the virtuous wife, while actually acting as a whore and being unfaithful. So again, this idea of appearance versus reality, this idea of proof here, and Othello not being able to see what Desdemona is, but her being used as this object of men to project what they want to see out of her. Her as a possession, her as valuable, her as a pearl even in the end, her as something to be owned and controlled and eaten and consumed and then belched at will. Breitenberg says, male heterosexual jealousy, the anxiety and violence engendered in men by a patriarchal economy that constructs masculine identity as dependent on the coercive and symbolic regulation of women's sexualities. This idea of women's sexuality determining, or the control of it determining one's masculinity. So Brabantio, for example, this makes sense why he's so furious, because he is actually losing much more than a modern audience might realize in terms of his masculinity here. And Smith says a voyeuristic preoccupation with Othello and Desdemona's sex life structures the entire thing, including the vividly pornographic image of the tupping black ram presented to her horrified father. So these anxieties, so we are thinking about this voyeurism and why we're so horrified as an audience by these descriptions. It's striking that every time the couple seems to be off stage in bed together, some plot convulsion is manufactured to disturb them. The play is fascinated and disturbed by its own spectacle of interracial sexuality. So it's almost this idea of irony and bathos back and forth of thinking of this fear that they will consummate and the Jacobean prejudices then will spin out of control. But also this idea that Shakespeare doesn't allow it to get quite as clear as that, because he keeps interrupting them, thus limiting their time and making this star-crossed lovers time even shorter than Romeo and Juliet. But also this idea of, if everyone's talking about their sex life so much, there must be something in this, which is these prejudices of fearing this. Then thinking about this object in particular that Desdemona is so aligned with. And again, I will read and then we will talk about, but this Othello describes it so well here. That's a fault. That handkerchief did an Egyptian give to my mother give. She was a charmer and could almost read the thoughts of people. She told her while she kept it, it would make her amiable and subdue my father entirely to her love. But if she lost it or made gift of it, key, my father's eye should hold her loathed, and his spirit should hunt after new fancies. She dying gave it to me and bid it me when my fate would have me wived to give it to her. I did so, and take heed on it. Make it a darling like your precious eye. Again, this idea of eye and ocular proof. Interesting. To lose it or give it away were such perdition as nothing else could match. 'Tis true, there is magic in the web of it. A Sibyl that had numbered in the world the sun to course 200 compasses, in her prophetic fury sowed the work. The worms were hallowed that did breed the silk. It was dyed in mummy, which the skilful conserved of maidens' hearts. Okay, so immediately there's so much there, right? There's this magic handkerchief that is made and dyed with maidens' hearts and holy worms. This idea of it taking on a kind of spiritual but also somewhat Christian, somewhat pagan power to it, while also thinking about this as a warning from Othello to Desdemona, even in this description of, if you lose it or give it away, I will hate you like my father would have hated my mother, and I will hunt after new people. So this idea of predation and punishment immediately would be such perdition, nothing else would match. This would be the worst thing you could do, in other words. And Iago knows this and says that the trifles light as air, such as a handkerchief, so like little, small, inconsequential things, are to the jealous confirmations strong as proofs of holy writ. So this idea that this handkerchief is, as the appearance of it, or something as small and insignificant as that, can be as much of a confirmation as the Bible on something. Othello says, villain, be sure thou prove my love a whore, be sure of it, give me the ocular proofs. This idea of I need proof, and this is what it is. This is the only proof that he ever has of Desdemona's supposed infidelity. Othello says, give me your hand, this hand is moist, my lady. So this idea when he is asking her about the handkerchief, of her sweating, of this kind of guilt, and him saying that he can read her hand, her palms, whilst also saying that this is a handkerchief that was created by a charmer who could read minds, etc. There's this kind of suggestion that her guilt will out. And Iago says, have you not sometimes seen a handkerchief spotted with strawberries in your wife's hand? This is critical because, as we said in our previous lesson, this idea of virginity test, the white handkerchief spotted with strawberries like spots of blood in a virginity test, where these sheets would be hung out for proof of a consummated marriage, particularly with nobility, where this mattered the most because the most was at stake. So this imagery here of red and white being critical to thinking about virginity here. And then Othello, as he stammers incoherently, seeing lie on her, lie on her. We say lie on her when they belie her. Lie with her, that's fulsome. Handkerchief, confessions, handkerchief. To confess and be hanged for his labour. First to be hanged, then to confess. I tremble at it. Nature would not invest herself in such shadowy passion without some instruction. It is not words that shake me thus. Pish, noses, ears and lips. Is it possible? Confess, handkerchief, O devil. So this idea here of the proof coming to him, and this being enough justification to, first of all, drive him linguistically to incoherence, and also to drive him to act. This is it. And he aligns this handkerchief with a confession twice. And the repetition of this handkerchief shows the importance, emphasizes its importance in Othello's mind as confirmation. Interesting, Jardine says all three of the women in the play are wrongfully accused of sexual misdemeanor in the course of the play. So this idea of the handkerchief being linked with sexual misdemeanor. Jardine also saying accusations about sexual promiscuity were the most readily available form of assault on a woman's reputation. So this idea of this is the easiest way for Othello to get at, for Iago to get at Othello, is this idea of what can destroy her reputation the quickest and most easily. Because how can you prove infidelity other than being the supervisor who gazes grossly on, or being some kind of proof of a love token here? So this idea of like the impossibility of this, so it's so damaging and such an easy, insidious thing to do. Then Cox said a man's honour was inseparable from his wife's behaviour. So this idea that if people see this handkerchief of Desdemona's in Cassio's hand, Othello is ruined. So this idea of dependence is so key, which perhaps shows why Othello is so hasty to condemn her. But Desdemona, hearing all of this, knowing all of this, loses it. Is she naive in thinking, oh, well, it doesn't matter that much? Is she careless? Is she in some way blamable for not being absolutely and entirely determined to track down this handkerchief? Here's what Desdemona and Emilia say here about it. Believe me, I had rather lost my purse full of crusaders, but my noble Moor is true of mind and made of no such baseness as jealous creatures are. It were enough to put him to ill thinking. So she'd first rather have lost her whole purse, all of her money, than this handkerchief. And she says, my noble Moor is of true mind, made of no such baseness as jealous creatures. So he's too good to be jealous. But even with this case, it was enough to put him to ill thinking. So saying this is enough for him to doubt me. So then why doesn't she do everything to get it? Emilia says, is he not jealous? Desmond said, who? He? I think the sun where he was born drew all such humours from him. I ne'er saw this before. Sure there's some wonder in this handkerchief. I am most unhappy in the loss of it. So first of all, the dramatic irony of knowing who has it, Emilia, and then Iago, and then Cassio. First of all, it's hard to see Emilia here in this way. But also there's this idea of her, Desdemona, thinking about and worrying about this misplacement. As Newman said, possession of a lady's handkerchief was considered proof of adultery. How does that change this for us? It seems like a trifle light as air until we consider the fact that this handkerchief, because perhaps it was such an intimate object, right? It's like underwear to a certain extent, right? It's for using on your mouth, using on your face. It's expensive. It's white. It's easily it's like to wipe your eyes and your nose, etc. It's not something to be shared, and it's also embroidered significantly so that people know who it is. So it's not easy to exchange this or to get away with this. This is proof of an intimate being given to someone else. It says a 15th century Venetian was fined and sentenced to 18 months imprisonment for taking a lady's handkerchief, seemingly because that's how gross, and by that I mean so terrible, this crime would be for 15th century Venetians, which is before obviously Shakespeare's time, but certainly these ideas Shakespeare might have drawn from. And this idea of physical legal punishment for taking a lady's handkerchief shows the extremity of Cassio having it. The optics of Cassio having that handkerchief are very bad indeed. What different roles does this handkerchief play? It plays a role as a love token, It plays a role as ocular proof. And these are both actually quotes, so we can think about that. Ocular proof. It is also white, so we're thinking of a proof of innocence. It is a connector between these different characters, so some kind of dramatic piece here. It's a symbol. It's a device or a prop for Iago as well, right? As he moves this around stage and keeps drawing our attention to it as well. Now let's take a look at Othello's view of Desdemona, and this is tracking us across the play. So as we move this way, we're thinking like this. This is the trajectory of the play. Othello starts by describing her as that I love the gentle Desdemona. I would not my unhoused free condition put into conscription and confined for the sea's worth. So he's saying, I wouldn't give up loving Desdemona for my freedom. And speaking as a black Moor in Venice, where there likely was exchange of slaves, or certainly the idea of slaves in the navy and in the military that both Othello and Iago would know, and Cassio as well. This is a more powerful thing to say here, right? That he wouldn't put it for the entire sea's worth. This idea that he wouldn't give it up for the world here. And then we move into this idea when she's doubted of Othello saying, her name that was as fresh as Dian's visage is now begrimed and black as mine own face. So this idea of her face that's like Diana's or Aphrodite's. And interesting that we say this, the goddess of love, who was meant to be born in or landed on Cyprus where they are, is interesting here as well, right? Because we're thinking about Cyprus and this place of love, but this idea of lust being there too, Aphrodite and lust are still linked. This idea of freshness of Aphrodite or Diana's visage, now begrimed, grimy, become grimy and black as my own face. Here, so her name being sullied, being dirty. Here, damaged, corrupted, etc. And from such a juxtaposition here as this visage and Othello's own face, which he says is begrimed and black, so dirty and black. So we can even see that internalized racism with him there. And this idea that dirt and soiled links to Desdemona. He thinks of her as something that's soiled. He also says to her, says about her, excellent wretch. Now, interesting here that wretch can mean two things. And this is when he's talking about still loving her, finding it difficult not to love her no matter what. Wretch is this idea of horrible, terrible. But it also contains this idea of abandonment. Someone who's an orphan. Or neglected. So there are different ways we can look at this as well in thinking of how he views her. She does literally leave her house and is essentially orphaned by her marriage. Is he thinking of this, the fact that she gave up everything to be with him? Or is he thinking, I've neglected my role here, this poor, uncontrolled girl is in danger without my supervision. It's hard to say. Then he describes her as the cunning whore of Venice that married with Othello. Okay, this is in the mini board scene where Othello pretends that Emilia is a pimp, or a bawd in their language, and Desdemona is a sex worker. And he kind of speaks to them like this. Emilia is furious. Desdemona is extremely hurt. But this idea of him as tricking her, this idea of cunning, this idea of trickery or deception, right? And whore of Venice. And there's also this of Venice. First of all, rhymes with the Moor of Venice. So there might be some wordplay there, but we're also thinking about this idea of reputation. Oh, I thought you were that whore of Venice who married with Othello. So this idea of whose language is this? This is society as well. Othello is viewing Desdemona the way that Iago and Brabantio and Rodrigo view her in Act 1 now, right? This idea of condemnation of her. And then here as well, if I quench thee, thou flaming minister, I can again thy former light restore. So this is describing her as he looks upon her in Act 5, Scene 2, as a candle here. And the candle becoming both her and her life, as well as perhaps her purity. Because he says, if I can blow you out, turn you off, I can then return you to your former light. So you can return to how you used to be in my eyes. Right, thy former light restore. First of all, she is again being compared to an object. So this is objectifying language. Secondly, we're thinking of him as acting as a god here, right? The power dynamic here is extremely unbalanced. Because he thinks he can change these things at will in order to preserve this. So interestingly, he prefers her purity and restoring that and restoring her former light to her actual life. What does this mean about her value to him and how he views her? Right? This means that he views her as an object, an idea, an idealization. We don't know. Now let's think about the first reaction to her supposed infidelity. He says, why is this? Thinkest thou I'd make a lie of jealousy to follow still the changes of the moon with fresh suspicions? No, to be once in doubt is once to be resolved. And here, just to highlight some places we can talk about here. To be once in doubt is once to be resolved. Exchange me for a goat when I shall turn the business of my soul to such exsufflicate and blown surmises, matching thy inference. 'Tis not to make me jealous to say my wife is fair, feeds well, loves company, is free of speech, sings, plays, and dances well. Where virtue is, these are more virtuous. Nor from mine own weak merits will I draw the smallest fear or doubt of her revolt, for she had eyes and chose me. No, Iago, I'll see before I doubt, and when I doubt, prove. And on this proof there'll be no more but this, away at once with love or jealousy. And again, feel free to put your reactions into the chat as we go. So he's saying, would I continue this jealousy and have it develop over the month and just kind of think about it to myself? No. To be once in doubt, to be once. So as soon as I'm doubting, I'm resolved, have to act. He's saying I can't match your inferences. it's not to make me jealous, all of these good things about my wife. Because when there is virtue, when there's good things, there's more good that comes. Neither will he worry about his own insecurities in thinking that would be a reason for her infidelity. Because she said, she had eyes and chose me. Crucial, right? He's saying, she chose me. So why would she cheat on me? And no, Iago, I'll see. So I'll see this, proof of this, before I doubt, when I doubt proof. So he's not just going to fly off the handle right now. He needs proof. But when there is proof either way, then away at once with love or jealousy. So either he's going to have proof of her infidelity and be done loving her immediately, or he will have proof of her innocence and be done with jealousy. So interestingly, that even though he is defending her and saying, no, 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 he's still able to entertain this idea of, well, if she's accused of that, if that's the case, I'm resolved, right? I am resolved and it will be done. I'm able to just cut off like this. Right? It's a little bit alarming, right? Because it shows that he is able to be manipulated. If Iago can do this, then Othello will be immediately set on this course of jealousy and destruction ensuing. Here are some critics and what they think about Othello's view of Desdemona here. Levis says that Othello didn't really know Desdemona, and Othello acquiesces in considering her as a type outside of his experience, the Venetian wife, as you can see in the asterisk here. A worldly woman, a temptress, allusion to Eve, fallen woman, however, expected to be submissive and subservient as living in a patriarchal society and curbed by a strong husband. So this Venetian wife, fitting that Desdemona is from Venice, Venetian wife who needs to be controlled by a powerful husband. Is Othello strong enough to do that? He doesn't know. It is plain then that his love is composed very largely of ignorance of self as well as ignorance of her. Again, these are the opinions of critics, so they're not necessarily our opinions, but they might be helpful either to support your argument or to refute it. It may be love, but it can only be an oddly qualified sense of love of her. It must be more of a matter of self-centered and self-regarding satisfactions, pride, sensual possessiveness, appetite, love of loving than he suspects. So Levis is actually suggesting it's these things, and he's actually self-centered. He's thinking of Desdemona as something to either add to or take away from his reputation, as something that is good for him to have, because it's good for his power, but that he doesn't actually love her like a person, and also doesn't know himself well enough to know if he would be able to control her. And Cavell says the problem of knowledge for Othello consists of his refusal to accept the unacceptable. Not that Desdemona is faithless, but that she's faithful. So Cavell is saying here, it's not that he can't believe that she is faithless, it's that he can't believe she could be faithful. So he doubts her immediately. Desdemona's faithfulness determines Othello's own failing. Her finitude, her bodily separateness, which she would erase by offering her virginity, marks Othello's own separateness, his own dependence. Othello's skepticism finally comes to reside in the inadmissible fact of his own finitude. So this idea of his separateness, his outsider status, he projects onto her as well. Othello, of course, chooses not to accept the mark of human separation, a choice that ultimately results in Desdemona's murder. What Othello claims to have thought a sacrifice will, he believes, rid him of his doubt, not about her fidelity, but about his status as an outsider. So if he's able to control her and to prove about her work, then he is able to confirm that he's not an outsider. And then Phillips says Othello's immediate reaction to Desdemona's supposed infidelity reveals his gross insecurity. So the idea that he is insecure and projects this into believing that she is unfaithful. Desdemona's ending here. Let's take a look at now. So this is Act 5, Scene 2. And Othello says, "Yet I'll not shed her blood, nor scar that whiter skin of hers than snow, and smooth as monumental alabaster. Yet she must die, or else she'll betray more men. Put out the light, and then put out the light. If I quench thee, flaming minster, I can again thy former light restore, should I repent me. But once put out the light, thou cunningest pattern of excelling nature, I know not where that is that Promethean heat that can thy light relume. When I have plucked thy rose, I cannot give it vital growth again. It must needs wither. I'll smell thee on the tree. O balmy breath, that dost almost persuade justice to break her sword. One more, one more. Be thus when thou art dead, and I will kill thee and love thee after." Kissing her, stage direction. "One more, and that's the last. So sweet was ne'er so fatal. I must weep, but they are cruel tears. This sorrow's heavenly, it strikes where it doth love." She wakes. And then Desdemona says, "Will you come to bed, my lord? Have you prayed tonight, Desdemon? Aye, my lord." So first of all, interesting here. We will get to this all in a moment. Desdemona also says in this scene, "And yet I fear you, for you're fatal then when your eyes roll so. Why I should fear I know not, since guiltiness I know not, but yet I feel fear." Desdemona says, "But while I say one prayer, it is too late." He smothers her. That's the actual moment of death there. And Desdemona, well, moment of death, but she dies seemingly a couple of times because she keeps talking after this stage direction. Desdemona says, "A guiltless death I die. Emilia, who hath done this deed? Nobody, I myself. Farewell. Commend me to my kind lord. Oh, farewell." And Othello says, "Being wrought." Okay, there's a lot here to talk about. First of all, in this first part here, looking at the imagery that then carries across this entire monologue, one of the most important monologues, I would say, of the play. Thinking about this whiteness, right? And his inability to see her as anything other than this idealization of perfection, literally a statue, right? That is untouchable and untouched. He doesn't want to scar it, and he wants it to stay smooth. So this idea of perfection and unsoiled perfection and coldness and remoteness as well, that shows her again to be this paragon of female Jacobean identity, but he views it as false. So this idea of appearance versus reality again, in that he can't see what he can't see. And then, "Yet she must die, or else she'll betray more men." So this idea of her as this kind of sacrifice here, that he later then describes her as well. A sacrifice here to preserve men. And then this idea of light. Both her life, her heat, her purity are all linked there to this idea of light. And he's saying, I can put you back in your former light, so I can look at you the way I used to. But he says he cannot restore her life once he's killed her. It must needs wither. So she cannot give her back once he's plucked the rose, once he's blown out the light. He can't give it back to her. It has to wither. But again, there's this idea of must needs. This idea of certainty, surety here. And balmy breath, it almost provides justice. So this idea of justice, capital J, being linked to the goddess Athena, and this idea of the concept of justice. Justice to break her sword, so to not be just anymore, to stop me from killing you. Your breath almost stops me from doing that. I can almost stop myself from doing this, but it would be justice to do it, and thus injustice not to. Again, he views her as this sacrifice that is just. And this seems to be he keeps kissing her, and then I will kill thee and love thee after. The irony here, right, is so clear. And that he can't love her as a real human being. This is almost sort of like Robert Browning poems, Porphyria's lover, here, when we're thinking about this preservation of virginity, etc. And this cold death will save her in a way. So sweet was never so fatal. So looking so sweet was never such a fatal thing to do, because it reinforces my idea that you are clearly deceiving me. And there's celestial imagery as well at the end here, which stands out again. She's too remote. She's supernatural in some way. She's not human. But then she asks, will you come to bed? This is quite transgressive thing to say. She's inviting him to bed. Again, not being passive, but inviting him into bed, presumably to have sex with him, possibly for the first time. And he just calls her Desdemona. So could this be just a nickname? Yes. Is it probably almost definitely relevant that the demon here is highlighted and foregrounded? I would say so. Yes, this view of her as devilish again. And then she doesn't seem to get it. She's afraid of him. He seems fatal, foreshadowing here, right, of what's going to happen when his eyes roll so. So this idea of out of control, demonic possession of this obsession. And then she says she doesn't know because she's not guilty. So she feels fear, but she hasn't done anything wrong. Then she asks to say a prayer as he's trying to kill her and overpower her. This is for the preservation of her soul here. If you don't pray before dying in this time, or especially if you're not given the last rites, then you go to hell, or you go to purgatory, possibly, because your sins haven't been washed away before you die. So Othello doesn't just kill her, he denies her the afterlife, which is actually would have been considered the grosser misdeed. He smothers her. Why is this important? Because he's silencing her, he's taking away her life, he's oppressing her physically, right? And again, she says she's guiltless. So we have this twice. No one has done this, but she tries to cover for him. She says she is taking credit for her own murder and thus covering for Othello. And we think this is now self-sacrifice, right? She is taking this on for her husband, knowing that killing yourself is the worst sin, and knowing that murder is the second worst sin. And even then she says, commend me. Like, speak to my kind Lord about me. Why this? She's so forgiving. She's so accepting of her fate. And Othello at the end says he's wrought. This is talking about why he's murdered her. He's wrought to the extreme. So he's pushed to the extreme. This idea that, is he taking blame? Because between here as well, he's also saying it was justified. Just actions did I take. So is he actually trying to wash away his own part in this? And here then we see as well, why would Shakespeare present this as Desdemona's ending? And as we spoke about already, could she have survived the play? I think he presented this to show her innocence, right? Possibly to assuage the Jacobean anxieties about miscegenation as well. Could she have survived the play? I don't think so. I think she was too transgressive. I think she and Othello's match was going to be doomed to fail because of the pressures of society, because of the pressures and how they enact and appear on both of them. And that Desdemona, like in Cynthia's version, would have to die to teach the Jacobean women, particularly daughters, possibly a lesson about transgression. And interesting here that we've got some critics who are talking about Desdemona's ending, but also more broadly about feminist theory, with Adrian Rich at the top there, saying the woman's body is the terrain on which the patriarchy is erected. Now, we talked about this in summer school, where we were talking about A Thousand Splendid Suns, and this idea of women being sacrificed, their bodies being used to preserve the patriarchy here. Same with De Luca. It becomes clear that these two different ways of describing women don't actually apply to real women. So this idea of previously talking about these fantasies imposed on women, the role they play, right? And this idea of, in Othello's mind, Desdemona isn't a real person. He can't see that. He can only see his fantasy of her and the role that she plays, right? And then O'Leary says the dramatization of Desdemona and Emilia's murders challenges some of the most fundamental assumptions of Elizabethan society and of our own, that outsiders should not interfere between husband and wife, and that an adulterous woman deserves death. So this is of the Jacobean era, but also, or Elizabethan era as well, but also that of modern society, right, in which society sometimes discourages intervention between husband and wife. It's sort of this private sphere, as well as this idea of an adulterous woman deserves death. It's not something that is supported by our society, but certainly there are sectors of society that do act this way, right? And treat women as this way of punishing them for their actions, or for the men's own inability to control them the way they want to. And also this idea of punishment being in the man's hands, like in Othello's. Now let's take a look at Desdemona and Emilia. So Emilia says, I durst my lord to wager that she is honest, lay down my life, my soul at stake. If you think other, remove your thought, it doth abuse your bosom. If any wretch have put this in your head, let heaven requite it with a serpent's curse. For if she be not honest, chaste, and true, there's no man happy. The purest of their wives is foul as slander. So this idea of Emilia unwittingly talking about Iago here, but also speaking to this idea of her willing to stake her own soul, something serious to Jacobean society, for the sake of Desdemona's honesty and defending her to Othello, who's questioning Emilia at this point. She's saying she's essentially the best of us. This listing here shows how good Desdemona is, how much she fulfills these expectations. The same with in Act 5, Scene 2, when Othello finds out the truth, runs at Iago, Iago stabs Emilia. Graziano says, the woman falls, sure he hath killed his wife. This is after they exclaim, surely you're not pulling your sword on a woman here. And Emilia says, oh, I, but lay me by my mistress' side. So this idea that Iago leaves her for dead, and Emilia wants to be next to Desdemona and lies next to her, and Emilia sings to her as Emilia herself dies here in the marriage bed with Desdemona. So there's this idea of this sororal bond, sisterly bond, in other words. And Emilia, with her final word, says, more she was chaste, she loved thee cruel more. So come to my soul to bliss as I speak true. So she is going to heaven because she is speaking truth, whereas, as Othello says, Desdemona, because she lied on her deathbed, is going to hell. But Emilia uses her last words to commend Desdemona and to indict Othello for his treatment of her. So she is the only one who defends Desdemona in reality. Neely says the central theme is love. It is Emilia who most explicitly speaks to this theme, recognizes the central conflict, and inherits from the heroines of comedy the role of potential mediator. So this makes sense here, right? and she's dramatically and symbolically the play's fulcrum. This also makes sense, right? She's the one who can see the truth. She's the one who steals the handkerchief. She's the one who tells the truth at the end. And O'Leary says, this female alliance as a tool of resistance against the power of destructive violence is starkly contrasted with the male unwillingness to take any personal risk in order to help the victims of violence. So Emilia defends Desdemona, reveals the truth, is killed for it, and everyone else seems to kind of stand round. The same with Emilia is so vitriolic towards Othello in the final scene, railing at him when she knows he's murdered Desdemona, and is the only one who seemingly does that. Let's also think of Desdemona's own power. Cassio describes her as our great captain's captain. So this idea of she has control over Othello, whether that be in the domestic sphere or outside of it, is unclear. Desdemona also says, do not doubt that before Emilia here I give thee warrant of thy place. This is talking to Cassio. Assure thee, if I do vow a friendship, I'll perform it to the last article. My lord shall never rest. I'll watch him tame and talk him out of patience. His bed shall seem a school, his board a shrift. I'll intermingle everything he does with Cassio's suit. Therefore be merry, Cassio, for thy solicitor shall rather die than give thy cause away. So here she's talking about she will not rest in convincing Othello to give Cassio back his position. She even calls herself his solicitor, his lawyer, in other words. So this idea that she thinks, perhaps naively, that she can control Othello, either with her words or in the bedroom as well. His bed shall seem a school. And then the same, Iago, look to her more if thou hast eyes to see. She has deceived her father and may thee. Yeah, so she was able to deceive her father. She had that power to do so. Even in speaking up for herself in the courtroom, she says, my noble father, I do perceive here a divided duty. To you I am bound for life and education. My life and education both do learn me how to respect you. You are the lord of duty. I am hitherto your daughter. But here is my husband, and so much duty as my mother showed to you, preferring her before your father, so much I challenge that I may profess due to thee more, my lord. So this idea that she says to her father, who's saying, get yourself back home now. How could you? We're going to arrest Othello and bring you back home. And she says, I'm not coming with you. Here's why. Honigman says it's possible to see her as the strongest, most heroic in the play. Tenenhouse says she's the embodiment of female power. Coleridge, interestingly, says she has no character at all. So interesting that we could incorporate that as a counter-argument there. And then Bradley describing femininity as linked with the monstrous. So there's having this kind of dark or transgressive power as well. Then let's think of, and I know we are getting pretty close to the end here, so just pointing out a couple of places. Iago, across the play, talks about Desdemona's sex and sex life. As he says, when she is sated with his body, she will find the error of his choice. So essentially, when she is finished having sex with him, she will realize that she's made a mistake in marrying him. So this is the idea of lust. Coleridge says, most surely, as an English audience was disposed in the beginning of the 17th century, it would be something monstrous to conceive of this beautiful Venetian girl falling in love with Othello. And it would argue a disproportionateness, a want of balance. So talking about Desdemona as having some failing that means that she's to blame for this. Is that something that we can argue for ourselves, that we feel comfortable arguing? Reimer as well, and this is a critic from many years ago, says she's a strumpet who lacks morals, so showing that she again is to blame here. And Ryan saying she has the gall here to prefer Othello to her own kind and to proclaim her love for this in public. Is this pushing it too far? Is this sealing her own fate? In what ways now is she a foil for Desdemona? Well, perhaps we can think of this as a way to address the opposition, the way that their power dynamic and their presentation is portrayed as so opposing in the play. For example, Desdemona is linked with celestial imagery and religious imagery linked with angels and the heavens, whereas Othello is linked with the devil, darkness, evil, night. Desdemona is linked with chastity and purity, whereas Othello is described as lascivious, the gross clasps, this tupping and covering, etc. But then again, we can counter that by saying that she is equally as lustful as they present him to be. He seems not to be. She is passive and unjealous. She's loyal entirely, whereas he is immediately jealous, immediately disloyal to his view of her. She is sort of stable across the play as well, until the end, just confirmed in love, where Othello has this immediate downfall that tracks across the whole play. Now, what we have in our last minute are just some places where you might find an opportunity to talk about Desdemona. So, for example, these are some questions that have come up in the past in different exam settings, different exam boards, etc. The idea of how Shakespeare presents women in Othello. So we can show that Desdemona is a passive object here, as are other women. And then spend time talking about Emilia and their sororal bond as well. There are also questions that speak specifically to Desdemona and her portrayal. So all of these different lines of arguments could serve them. And we could also think of this idea of the presentation of love, right? What does love look like? Love looks like, does Othello really love or even see Desdemona? Can we think of Desdemona's love as naive? Can we see it, his love for her as idealized? Can we see her ending as confirming of her love, or love as fated or doomed? Can we see these anxieties about miscegenation as part of this presentation of love, or the societal pressures on them as part of this? As well as the presentation of power, right? Not just Desdemona's power, but also Othello's power over her, the power dynamic in their relationship, the power of jealousy and how it influences Othello's treatment of Desdemona, and how this leads to the ending as he tries to reclaim power and take power from Desdemona, and does so destroying himself as well. So we are at the end of our lesson now. I have included for you as well just some space where you can jot down some of these notes for yourself. So thinking about where you can put these ideas of Desdemona, and this may be a good place to pop down just the lines of argument from today's lesson that you'd like to include if this was a question that came up for you. So presentation of Desdemona is a great one, because we can think, okay, her as an object, her as transgressive, her marriage as loving, her marriage as doomed, her death, her sororal bonds with Emilia, right? Her naivete and blamability, her as linked with the handkerchief. All of these are, there are so many different lines that all could be a paragraph at least. Same with women, not just Desdemona, but because Desdemona is key to the plot of the play, we could think about women as passive. We could think about Desdemona's presentation as the epitome of Jacobean femininity. We can think of her embodying the Madonna-whore dichotomy, etc. Same with love. As I said, different loves. We could include a paragraph about sororal love, so the love between Desdemona and Emilia, as well as the love, obviously, between Othello and Desdemona, or even Othello and Iago, or her as an object. That brings us to the end of our lesson. Hi, Cutie Blade. Thank you for popping in to say hello at the end here. Thank you, everyone, for participating today, for joining us. I hope that this has benefited you. If you missed any at any point, or you feel like you just want to go back, this live stream will be published and public on YouTube, so you'll be able to access it at any point. So if you have mocks upcoming soon, or you're getting that schedule in around this time of year, then fear not, because this will still be here for you to do some review as well, to return to these ideas, to go back to the quotations and the critical theory there that will bring you a little bit further in your answers. Scott said, Iago is seen as a pure villain, which is obviously, but Emilia's married him. Emilia steals the handkerchief, gives it to Iago, yet we have still emphasised the sororal bond to Desdemona. Not a fan. Yeah, so it really is complex, right? Because they seemingly do love each other. Maybe this speaks to the power dynamics in Jacobean society, right? A woman's role was to serve her husband first and foremost. So that's complex, right, to think about. And that could certainly, Scott, be a paragraph in and of itself, is thinking Emilia has the sororal bond with Desdemona, but because she steals the handkerchief, she is complicit in Desdemona's destruction and thus does not deserve the audience's sympathy, or gets her just desserts, or whatever it is you want to argue at the point. Okay. Great. I'm so glad. Thank you, Scott, and thank you everyone who joined. I hope this was helpful for you again, and we will see you next lesson. This will be next Wednesday on Brabantio, Cassio, and Rodrigo. So 3 all in one lesson. We're going to cover quite a lot. Hope to see you there. Tell your friends. This will be free for you to stream and see live, or see whatever time serves you. Bye.